The room was silent when he finally pressed record. No film crew. No script supervisor. No second takes. Just him, and the weight of everything he had survived. At 71, a man who once lit up dance floors and movie screens across the world sat alone, staring into a camera like it was an old friend he might never see again. His voice was calm, but something deeper lingered beneath the surface. Something final. For decades he had been larger than life. A symbol of charm, resilience, and reinvention. But now, behind closed doors, something had shifted. He had begun giving away personal belongings, items he had kept close for nearly half a century. Letters, memorabilia, pieces of a life that once defined him. Friends noticed. Family grew concerned. And those closest to him began asking questions he refused to answer directly. Why now? Why was he saying goodbye? Because what nobody expected was this. After surviving fame, scandal, heartbreak, and unimaginable loss, John Travolta had quietly reached a moment that would change everything. And this time there would be no script to guide him. Long before the fame, before the flashing cameras and standing ovations, he was just a boy growing up in a modest home in New Jersey. The youngest of 6 children, he lived in a house where dreams often felt bigger than reality. His mother believed in performance like it was oxygen. She filled their home with theater rehearsals, music, and endless imagination. To young John, the stage wasn't just entertainment. It was escape. It was survival. At school, things were different. He didn't fit in. He was quiet, sensitive, easy to target. Kids mocked him for his voice, his posture, even his dreams. The pain followed him home, but instead of breaking him, it transformed him. Because inside that shy, bullied boy lived something powerful. He discovered that when he performed, people stopped laughing at him and started watching him. Really watching him. And for the first time in his life he felt seen. That feeling became addictive. By the time he was a teenager, he made a decision that terrified his family. He walked away from school and stepped into the unknown, chasing a career that had no guarantees. New York City wasn't kind. He slept in tiny rooms, lived paycheck to paycheck, wondered more than once if he had made the worst mistake of his life. But something inside him refused to quit. He auditioned endlessly, faced rejection more times than he could count. Each no chipped away at his confidence, but also hardened his resolve. Because he wasn't just chasing fame. He was chasing purpose. And then, slowly, the doors began to open. Television roles turned into film auditions. Film auditions turned into career-defining opportunities. And before the world even realized what was happening, John Travolta had become one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. His rise wasn't gradual. It was explosive. One performance turned him into a cultural phenomenon almost overnight. Suddenly, his walk, his voice, his presence, it all became iconic. People didn't just watch him. They became obsessed with him. He had everything. Money, fame, adoration. But behind the scenes, something fragile was forming. Because fame gives you everything, except protection from loss. The first crack came early. Someone he loved deeply was taken from him without warning. The grief was disorienting. It shattered his sense of stability and forced him to confront something he had never truly faced before. Mortality. He buried himself in work. Forced himself to keep moving. Keep performing. Keep smiling. But grief doesn't disappear. It waits. And years later, it returned in ways he could never have imagined. His career, once unstoppable, began to shift. The roles became less predictable. The public became less forgiving. Hollywood, which once embraced him, began to drift. He wasn't finished. But he wasn't invincible either. Still, he fought his way back. Reinvention became his survival mechanism. When people counted him out, he proved them wrong. When critics doubted him, he delivered performances that reminded everyone why he mattered. But success couldn't shield him from what came next. Because nothing could prepare a father for the moment his world would collapse completely. It happened suddenly. Without warning. One ordinary day became the worst day of his life. His son was gone. The loss was so devastating, so incomprehensible, that it broke something deep inside him. Not publicly. Not visibly. But internally. He continued to exist. But he was never the same. Friends noticed the change immediately. He became quieter. More introspective. More careful with his emotions. The man who once thrived on attention now protected his privacy like armor. And then came another blow. The woman who had stood beside him through everything was gone too. His wife, his partner, his emotional anchor. She had been his constant in a world defined by chaos. And suddenly she wasn't there anymore. Her absence created a silence that no applause could fill. For the first time since his rise to fame, John Travolta wasn't just grieving. He was alone. Completely alone. The world saw glimpses of his pain through public tributes and emotional messages. But what they didn't see was what happened afterward. The quiet mornings. The empty spaces. The memories that lingered in every corner of his home. He carried it all privately. Because that's what survivors do. They carry what others can't see. But then, something strange began happening. In recent years, those closest to him noticed subtle changes. He began simplifying his life. Reducing distractions. Letting go of possessions he once considered irreplaceable. At first it seemed harmless. Almost therapeutic. But the pattern continued. And then it intensified. He wasn't just organizing his life. He was preparing it. Friends described moments that felt surreal. Conversations that hinted at reflection. At closure. He wasn't depressed. He wasn't afraid. He was peaceful. That's what frightened them most. Because peace like that usually comes after acceptance. Acceptance of something most people spend their lives avoiding. The truth is, John Travolta had spent decades outrunning grief, reinvention, and expectations. But now he wasn't running anymore. He was standing still. Facing everything. And then came the moment that confirmed their fears. He recorded a message. Not for a film. Not for a role. For his fans. His voice carried warmth, gratitude, and something else. Finality. He didn't say goodbye explicitly. But he didn't need to. Because between his words lived something unspoken. He thanked people for walking beside him. For believing in him. For giving his life meaning beyond anything he could have imagined. Those who heard it felt something shift. It didn't feel like promotion. It felt like closure. And suddenly the rumors began. Whispers spread online. Speculation grew louder. Why was he stepping back? Why was he giving things away? Why now? The truth wasn't dramatic. It wasn't scandalous. It was human. He had reached a point in life where legacy mattered more than momentum. Where presence mattered more than performance. He wasn't chasing relevance anymore. He was protecting meaning. Because after everything he had endured, every loss, every reinvention, every heartbreak, he understood something most people never truly grasp. Life isn't defined by how brightly you shine. It's defined by what remains when the spotlight fades. For John Travolta, that realization didn't bring fear. It brought clarity. He had given the world unforgettable moments. Characters that would outlive generations. Performances that would never disappear. But beyond the fame, beyond the headlines, beyond the legend, he was just a man who had loved deeply. And lost deeply. And survived. That survival came with scars. Invisible but permanent. The turning point came quietly. Not during a public appearance. Not on a movie set. But in solitude. He looked around at everything he had built. The awards. The memories. The life he had lived. And he asked himself a question few people ever ask honestly. What matters now? The answer wasn't fame. It wasn't success. It was peace. He began focusing on the people who remained. His children. His closest friends. The relationships that grounded him in reality rather than illusion. He chose presence over performance. Connection over recognition. Because he had learned, through unimaginable loss, that time is the only thing you can never reclaim. The fallout wasn't dramatic. There was no scandal. No controversy. Just quiet acceptance. Fans noticed his absence from certain projects. Not as withdrawal. But as intention. He wasn't disappearing. He was choosing. Choosing where his energy belonged. Choosing what truly deserved his time. Public reaction was mixed. Some feared the worst. Others respected his decision. But those who understood his journey knew the truth. This wasn't surrender. This was evolution. Because saying goodbye doesn't always mean leaving forever. Sometimes, it means letting go of the version of yourself that no longer exists. The man who danced through global fame was still there. But he had changed. Grief had reshaped him. Love had softened him. Loss had awakened him. And what remained was something even more powerful than fame. Wisdom. In his final recorded message there was no sadness. Only gratitude. He spoke not like someone ending a story. But like someone who had finally understood it. Because the truth was never about goodbye. It was about legacy. And legacy isn't defined by how long you stay in the spotlight. It's defined by what you leave behind when you step out of it. John Travolta didn't need another role to prove his impact. He had already done that. Through resilience. Through reinvention. Through survival. And as he stepped back from the noise, from the expectations, from the endless demands of a world that never stops watching, He gave himself something he had earned long ago. Not because his story was ending, but because he had finally learned how to live beyond it. And perhaps for the first time in his life, he wasn't performing anymore. He was simply being human.